History as it happens, February 18th, 2021. It's a conspiracy.
So what I did is I started looking up things on the internet, asking questions like most people do every day. Use Google. And I stumbled across something, and this was at the end of 2017, called QAnon.
If you're wondering how anyone could believe in QAnon conspiracies, wait till you hear what some of our founders believed in. From George Washington to QAnon, conspiratorial thinking in American politics. As we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The so-called plane that crashed into the Pentagon. It's odd, there's never any evidence shown for a plane in the Pentagon.
They shouldn't be called Democrats. They should be referred to properly as the Commie Crap Party.
Have you ever heard of a thing called fluoridation? Fluoridation of water?
Hey everyone, right as I started putting this show together, I spotted a headline. The Pizzagate gunman is out of prison. Remember him? Well, you may not remember his name, Edgar Madison Welch. He was a warehouse worker in North Carolina, and he latched on to something he saw on the internet. It was a viral conspiracy theory that a pizzeria in D.C. was really a front for a child sex abuse ring run by powerful Democrats. So one morning 4 years ago, he drove 350 miles, walked into the pizza place with his assault rifle, and we can all be grateful, found no dungeons. And no one was physically injured in what will forever be known as Pizzagate. 4 years later, we're dealing with Pizzagate on steroids.
There is an Islamic invasion into our government offices right now.
Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene is often called the QAnon Congresswoman, the first adherent of those lunatic fringe conspiracies to be elected to Congress. In a moment, we'll talk to historian Joseph Ellis about QAnon and conspiracy theories in general. By now, you've probably read what QAnon believes in, for instance, the idea that a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles runs the world. QAnon disciples were big supporters of President Trump, and they believe the 2020 election was stolen, a deadly conspiracy theory given what happened on January 6th. As Richard Hofstadter wrote many years ago, American politics has often been an arena for angry minds, what Hofstadter called in his famous book, The Paranoid Style. True enough, but these days you may be asking, just what the hell is going on in our country? Well, some folks may have asked that same question when the most infamous of all American conspiracy theories was wielded by this man in the 1950s.
There is that small, closely knit group of administration Democrats who are now the complete prisoners and under the complete domination of the bureaucratic, communistic Frankenstein which they themselves have created. To call them Democrats is an insult to the millions of loyal American Democrats. They shouldn't be called Democrats. They should be referred to properly as the Commie Crap Party.
Yes, that was Senator Joseph McCarthy. He exploited anti-communist paranoia to destroy people's lives until he went too far by attacking the army in the Eisenhower years. Around the same time, crazy conspiracy theories about what was in the drinking water gained traction too.
Fluoridation is the most monstrously conceived and dangerous communist plot we have ever had to face.
One of my favorite movies, General Jack Ripper in Dr. Strangelove, a caricature of red paranoia. And that was when the John Birch Society and other far-right groups raised alarms about the dangers of fluoridation, although the Birchers to this day say they never claimed it was a commie plot.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
So, the reason I'm bringing up these examples isn't to compare one conspiracy theory to another or to say one is less nutty than the next, or to mock them, the clips of Dr. Strangelove notwithstanding. On the contrary, we have to take these ideas seriously, just as their believers do. Consider how widespread some of these dangerous theories are. A Morning Consult poll in early February found 18% of those who had heard of QAnon said they believe the group's claims were at least somewhat accurate, and that was down from 24% late last year. Historian Joseph Ellis is a leading scholar on early American history and the founding generation. He's authored 9 books, winning a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award. His most recent work is titled American Dialogue: The Founders and Us, and he has a book coming out in September, The Cause: The American Revolution and Its Discontents. Joseph Ellis, we are honored to have you. Welcome.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be with you.
I admire the premise of your book, American Dialogue, because, if I may, the aim of the podcast is the same. We try to understand how the past shapes our understanding of the present. So before we get into the founders and other American eras, I am interested in your thoughts, as a scholar of early U.S. history, on QAnon and the fact such fringe ideas have made it to the mainstream. What went through your head as you watched the mob, whose members believe the election was stolen, attack the Capitol building in the name of democracy and freedom?
I'm a citizen in that role, not a historian, but I thought these people sincerely believe Donald Trump won the election and that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. And how can they continue to believe that from a man who has lied to them for 4 years and who is obviously a mentally, emotionally, and morally impaired human being? But they do. I don't doubt their sincerity. But on the book trail over the recent past, for the last 2 years, in my efforts to engage people that hold to those views, I found it very difficult. They're living in a separate cul-de-sac, or they would think I'm living in a cul-de-sac, I guess. I think you can blame it on the internet a little bit. But you're right to suggest that conspiracy theories are as old as American history, and you don't have to start with the Constitution. The opposition to Britain in 1773, 74, 75 was based on a conspiracy theory. Great Britain was plotting to enslave American colonists. There's always a kernel of truth to any conspiracy theory. But in this case, Great Britain was attempting to consolidate its North American empire after winning it at the end of the French and Indian War, all the land east of the Mississippi, and they wanted to make it more coherent and more consolidated. They wanted to make colonists second-rate British citizens, but not slaves. Nevertheless, if you read the pamphlets of the American Revolution, there's among very sane and sensible people, to include John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, James Otis. The word slavery is the word. They're trying to enslave us. In 75, who was it? The great British writer
Samuel Johnson?
Samuel Johnson, thank you. He said, why is it we always hear the loudest yelps for freedom from drivers of slaves? And so that slavery metaphor came back to haunt them. Pressing it a bit further, conspiracy, and I think you mentioned in your introduction that Richard Hofstadter, people should read The Paranoid Style in American Politics, also a book that he wrote that's in some ways better on the same thing. It's called Anti-Intellectualism in American Thought. Or On the Revolution, I strongly recommend Bernard Bail and the Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. Both of those historians are talking about the way in which, in the founding of the United States, emotional appeals to conspiratorial theories that were irrational but potent played a role. They played a role in the debate over the Constitution later on, when the anti-federalists were arguing, the people opposing the Constitution, that any projection of authority from a distant government was dangerous and cannot be trusted in. Who knows what those people are doing up there in Philadelphia behind our backs? And if I was searching for some kind of generalization, what I'd say to you is that any republic which has a base that is democratic, we don't create a democracy, we create a republic. In fact, the word democracy is an epithet in the founding era. And I've noticed in something you sent me that you referred to Jefferson's party as the Democratic Republican Party. You find that in textbooks all over the place. It was not called that. It was called the Republican Party. It becomes complicated because the Republican Party becomes the Democratic Party later on. Mm-hmm. But that the word democracy refers to mob rule. And Adams and other theorists of the American Republic always thought that because the Republic was based on a democratic belief, we the people, it was always vulnerable to conspiracy theories and to demagogues. They got this from Thucydides. They got this from Tacitus in Rome. Tocqueville writes about this too later on, that because the foundation of the republic is popular opinion is inherently manipulable, it's swoonish, and it is vulnerable to demagogues who are looking to tell you who to blame for your problems. I think that the current problem we face is amplified by the internet, as people can live in their apps. But it's merely a continuation and an expansion of a problem that we'll always have with us as long as we are a republic with a democratic foundation.
So you mentioned anti-intellectualism in your answer. The founders, however, many of them, not all of them, but many of them were intellectuals in their day, and they seem to have gotten caught up in this thinking. You mentioned the Revolutionary Era notion that the British wanted to enslave the colonists. Did men like Jefferson, who owned slaves, really believe that, or were they saying it to stir up emotions?
Based on what you could see in their private correspondence, they really believed it. And there's always a kernel of truth to most conspiracy theories. What they would say to your question is, okay, they want to make us colonists, not slaves, but we're surrendering control over our political lives to them. And we have to trust that they're not going to abuse that control. And who can tell whether they will or not? And then when they send an army over to Boston in 1774 and impose martial law on the the colony of Massachusetts, it's a verification that they're going to militarize the situation. And when the British Army with their Hessians comes into New York in 76, there's rape. They destroy entire towns in Maine with fire bombs. And so that the predictions about the character of British policy seem to be fulfilled by British actions and give truth to the highly intelligent and well-read founding generation that's opposing this form of British imperialism.
Okay, George Washington, not an intellectual, but no dummy either. Let's talk about him a bit and the Illuminati, which was part of...
Tell them who are the Illuminati?
I'd rather you tell them who the Illuminati are. That's why I have you on here.
Well, you tell me what you think they are.
Doing research for this podcast, I actually wasn't very familiar with them.
Well, I think that Washington, among the founders, is the most realistic. I would say so is Adams. Jefferson is very idealistic. Washington was a heavy defender of groups of people who gathered together to serve particular social purposes, like the Illuminati or the Society of the Cincinnati. And he believes that the attempts to stigmatize their efforts are misguided and hyperbolic and misconstrue their motives. And he was particularly committed to the notion that political parties, which he regarded as the snake in the Garden of Eden, were manipulating popular opinion and developing fears based on what were really sensible and religiously sincere people. But you're right. If you're looking for a period of time when really hyperbolic conspiracy theories start to merely materialize, it's the 1790s, as parties come into existence and really crazy things get said. The press is not regulated.
It was scurrilous, quite scurrilous.
It was really, really scurrilous. And there was a newspaper called the Aurora, the journal of the Jeffersonian Republicans. They released information that showed that all throughout the war, Washington had really been a spy for the British. This was fake information the British had released during the war to try to undermine Washington's authority. When Washington eventually stepped down from the president, they put out an editorial saying, "We all pray for your imminent death. Pray for your imminent death." This is Washington, okay, who, if anybody can stand above it all, it was Washington. The Federalists run bad ads against Jefferson in the election of 1796 and 1800, mostly accusing him of being an atheist. He really wasn't an atheist. He was really a deist, but he wasn't as much of an Episcopalian as he claimed to be. Eventually, one of the people that Jefferson hires, a guy called James Thomas Callender, accuses Jefferson of having an illicit relationship with one of his slaves. Turns out that's actually true. although we didn't find out for sure until DNA evidence in 1997. But I think that back to the core point, democracies, any government in which popular opinion is the foundation, is vulnerable to conspiracy theories for reasons that require psychiatrists and sociologists to explain, and that the founding era was as much a breeding ground for that as our own time, and we're not that different. My verdict as a historian is that the guardrails held in 2020. My concern is that Trump has demonstrated how to be a demagogue, and he is an incompetent demagogue. He is a pioneer for subsequent demagogues that are going to come our way. And the closer we get to 2045, when the white population becomes a statistical minority, the more vulnerable we are, because the race issue is the ultimate card to play.
And of course, our founders warned us about demagogues. When it comes to our founders, how important were those conspiracy theories relative to everything else that motivated their conduct? In other words, were the conspiracies all-consuming like they seem to be for QAnon, or were they less important in the conduct of public affairs?
It's hard to get a barometer to measure less and more on matters that ephemeral. I think that both Washington and Adams as president saw themselves as presidents who would represent the public interest, res publica. The public interest is not the same thing as popular interest. Popular interest at any given time is evanescent, misguided, and they need to be able to stand above that. So they perceived many of these wild theories as something that they needed to simply ignore and do the right thing. And if that meant they lost the election, in Adams's case, that's okay. That's what they're supposed to do. All elected officials in a republic are disposable. No one can stand above the law. No one can be the equivalent of a divine right monarch. And both of them, therefore, dismissed so much of the paraphernalia going on beneath them. And in Adams's case, it meant he lost the election of 1800 as a result, because he did an unpopular thing. He refused to go to war with France. If he'd gone to war with France, he would have been reelected.
From reading the work of scholars such as yourself, it really is remarkable to learn just how influential certain ideas were in the 1790s. For instance, the Federalists and Adams believed the Jeffersonians wanted to bring the chaos of the French Revolution to the United States, and the Jeffersonians believed the Federalists wanted to reimpose a British monarchy. But as you said, there was at least some basis in reality to these ideas.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Jefferson did support the French Revolution. He believed the French Revolution was the American Revolution abroad. When his secretary, William Short, wrote him from Paris after he'd come back to America, that he could watch out his window as the heads were rolling past his apartment, and some of them belonged to his former friends, Jefferson said, I don't want to hear that. Don't talk to me about that. These are unfortunate excesses in what is a noble cause. He later in his life, in the correspondence with Adams, admitted he was wrong about the French Revolution. He didn't think it was going to lead to Napoleon. Adams always knew that. There, in some sense, is a collision here. Adams and Jefferson are the best examples of it, between the 2 points of view that both are present in the founding. Is government us or them? Is government an alien force, or is government a projection of our collective interests as a people? And Jefferson believes government is them, and that any form of government that imposes itself on opinion is tyranny. Now, when he gets to be president, he takes the most extreme executive action in American presidential history by the purchase of Louisiana. It's really an oppositional ideology. It opposes whoever's in power. It's the view of the Republican Party now. The Republican Party knows what it's against. It doesn't know what it's for.
Conspiracy theories were rife in the 19th and 20th centuries, too. At the start of the podcast, I mentioned McCarthyism, for instance. But it does seem like we are living in a different universe right now, with QAnon and with information bubbles and the amplification of the internet. Does QAnon remind you of anything in U.S. history?
It does. It reminds me of the know-nothings, which is a party that came into existence in the 1850s. It was an anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic party. But the major insight was that the papacy was directing the actions of all Irish immigrants and a threat to the purity of the race or purity of Anglo-Saxonism. It captured certain state legislatures, and there were many representatives in the House that were know-nothings. The term didn't mean they knew nothing, but it was whenever asked about what they thought, they would say, I know nothing about it because I don't want to reveal what our covert schemes are. The know-nothings are an extremist group that enjoyed a certain amount of success for a brief period of time. What's the name of the woman who's elected recently from Georgia?
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, to the extent the Republican Party is prepared to head in her direction, it is committing suicide. If, in fact, the Republican Party is committed to conspiracy theories that endorse the notion that Biden lost the election, I mean, to me, that's a losing proposition, even though in the short term, it might be a winning proposition. I agree with what you said earlier. I'm somebody that spends a good deal of his time living in another century. And my wife sometimes gets upset because I'm not paying attention to what she says. But in our moment here in 21st century America, I do think that level of lunacy is unprecedented. I said earlier, I think we can blame this in part on the internet, but I also think we can blame it on the way in which the narrative of American history has been fundamentally changed since Reagan, mostly by big money. And this is the Dark Money book by the woman from the New Yorker. And
Jane Mayer.
Jane Mayer. And there's also a recent book by, Anderson called Evil Geniuses. Billionaires have thrown millions of dollars and created these various and sundry think tanks to make us, the Federalist Society, the Heritage Society, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, all these things stigmatize government. And we're 330 some million people now. We're not 4 million people living along the Atlantic coast. The size of the United States now makes it more vulnerable to this because people don't know each other. How you measure the relative degree of lunacy now versus earlier times is difficult. As a historian, what I'm trying to optimistically say is that Trump is the first outright demagogue we've ever elected. We've had demagogues, McCarthy, the guy from Louisiana,
Huey Long,
George
Wallace.
Yep. Trump's the first person to be elected president who's an outright demagogue. And he's failed, but he has demonstrated that there's a constituency out there that is substantial. It's not 73 million, but it might be 30 million. I don't know how big it really is. And that's not going to go away for racial reasons, for economic, as people's jobs are replaced by technology. And if a guy like Trump, who really has never read the Constitution, can't read a Constitution, who is as ignorant as Trump can succeed, it bodes badly for us.
Well, let's close with this, if I'm correctly interpreting the pessimism in your answers.
Right.
We may agree that there's really no way to stop this problem of people believing in conspiracy theories. A Morning Consult poll in early February found 18% of those who had heard of QAnon said they believed the group's claims were at least somewhat accurate. There's nothing accurate about QAnon.
I concur. I mean, there are things that I would argue that we should try to do. I mean, I would like to do away with the Electoral College. That would be a step in the right direction because the current system, nobody in the rest of the world understands what we're doing. And the founders would be stunned to believe that we still have it. They left Philadelphia in September 1787 thinking that it was probably the worst thing they did. It was a compromise. I think that we should make the civics test that every incoming immigrant must pass, a test that all high school graduates have to pass. Because conspiracy theories depend upon misinformation. Misinformation depends on ignorance of what really is true in American history. Certainly Trump could never pass it. I think that some form of mandatory national service that puts people in, now that we've ended the draft, that we no longer have anybody in Congress who's ever served in the military, with a very few exceptions. We need things that bring us together in ways that would not happen normally. I think that Biden's proposed Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a replication of a New Deal program, is one step in that direction. As much as we can do to create venues in which dialogue goes on. In the end, that's what the Constitution is. It's not a set of truths. It's a framework to argue about what the truths are. Education has failed us in that. I mean, higher education as well as high school and middle school education has failed us in that regard. We're not beyond redemption. And as I say, the guardrails held this time, but we've been told that we're vulnerable here. This group of people that believe in these conspiracy theories are not going to go away, but the Republicans have a big role to play here. We need a center-right party to match a center-left party. And right now, they seem to be unwilling to go in the direction they need to go for short-range political reasons. Ultimately, that's where they have to go. I'm pessimistic in the sense that I'm realistic, and conspiracy theories themselves will never die, but they need to be kept at the fringe rather than at the center.
Joseph Ellis, thank you for joining us. It was our honor to have you. You know, that last remark brings to mind a story from the early years of the conservative movement when William F. Buckley kept the John Birch Society at the margins. Does QAnon have a future inside the Republican Party, or will Marjorie Taylor Greene be the first and last QAnon lawmaker under the party's banner? We'll know soon enough. The 2022 midterms aren't that far off. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
Sentiamo come una creazione della nostra volontà attesa dello spasimo della vittoria.
That's the voice of Europe's first fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini. We've already dedicated an episode to understanding socialism. Next, understanding fascism, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.